Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we will talk about how to work and how to handle users in our applications, because let's face it, no matter what application you are building, working with user is one of the key tasks that you would have to do. And based on the code that the code samples that I have reviewed and different projects from different sources, even demos from the official Microsoft documentation or on GitHub or even real production software, I think I have come across about some problems that you might use, or well, you are not maybe aware about the problems that you might have, the way that you have set up users or the way that users were set up initially, because in a lot of cases when you start to work on a project, it's not you that have defined things. But the purpose of this video is actually to kind of like look at the wrong ways in which you can work with users in your .NET applications and try to actually then pinpoint a best practice or what would be a good practical way to actually do this. Because let me be very, very clear. Unfortunately, even in the official Microsoft documentation, I have seen code samples and instructions on how to set up different things that are not practical at all and that will cause you a lot more problems than solve problems in your day-to-day applications. So let's start having a look at this, and let's hear, I have this already prepared, a very, very basic solution with 3 different projects in which I want to pinpoint 2 very, very popular ways in which user can be handled. And then of course I have one project for the way that I think might be suitable and the most practical approach when it comes to user handling in your day-to-day applications. So let's start to do this, and let's assume that right now we are tasked to actually create from scratch an application where we want to manage employees, like something like an HR system or something similar. So that's kind of like the main purpose that we want to do there. And a very first approach and the very, very first thing to do, which is very common because it comes somehow naturally, I would say, when you start a new application, is that you would probably go and add a new class there, and you'll call this class user. And you have this user class, and I will populate this class with some properties, with some code that I have already prepared, and we'll walk through it. So that's what you would normally do. So the first instinct is this: okay, I have to handle users the one way or the other. Now let's create a user class, and in this user class I have username because we want the user to have a username. We have a password, and then we have an email address, which kind of also belongs to this concept of having a user that needs to log in, because you might want to verify the email address or the password or the account via an email address or things similar to that. But then we have some other information that are very, very specific to our use case of the application that we want to build. Like we have here a first name. Of course, we could have a last name, but I really just want to showcase you the way that you would have to think about this thing. So that's really not an extensive approach with all the properties that you might need for this exact use case. Of course, we have the job title, we have the department, and then we have something like a monthly salary. So that would be the first thing that you would have to think of. Now, then of course I also have prepared here, you usually have to also work with this with Entity Framework Core. So you will go here and you would have public db set of user, and you call this users get set, and we should theoretically be good to go. Okay, db set, I guess I spelled this the wrong way, db set of user, and that would do it. Okay, sorry, not in the constructor, that was my bad. Let's move this out of the constructor, and it would be something like that. It's a regular property. Now the thing is here that there are a lot of things when you work with users that you have to think about and implement if you go with this approach, which once again comes very naturally. Because if we work with passwords, this is the very, very first thing. It is that we cannot simply store passwords in plain text in our database. So we have to use cryptography and different type of algorithms to actually hash the passwords and store the hashed value of the password in our database. And this is something that you have, or that you would need to actually implement from scratch by yourself. Of course, you could use the cryptography namespace that we have, and then use some cryptographic algorithms from there, and that would make your life much easier. But you would have to really think about all the different edge cases and the possible problems and security vulnerabilities, and you would have to take care about all of them in your application. Furthermore, you would have to also think about ways and mechanisms to change the password, maybe to, I don't know, maybe to implement even multi-factor authentication and all things similar to that. And all these things are things that you would need, once again, to take care your own and implement fully in your application. And that, of course, is really not optimal at all, because we already have libraries that have implemented this for us, and they probably have done a better job than most of us would do if we would need to implement all of this stuff on our own. So that's the first big problem with this approach, that you kind of like may introduce vulnerabilities in your system, because you would have to handle really sensitive tasks about identities here. But then there is another problem with this approach, in which, if we look at these properties and conceptually think about what we actually, or what's actually the boundary, the scope of this user class. So what does this user class need to do? So we have here, well, at least two different concerns, I would say, for this class. So first of all, we have this part like username, password, email address, that would belong to something that we would generally call identity management, and how do we want to user registrations, user logins, and things similar to that. And then we have some other properties, like these four properties, that are kind of like responsible for what a user actually means in our application use case. Like, a user is an employee. In our case, it needs to have a first name, probably also last name. It surely has, or need to have, a job title, a department, and of course, users or employees need to be paid, so they would also have a monthly salary. So we have here kind of like two different concerns: identity management, and then we have this employee stuff, or employee management. And kind of like, when you have two concerns in the same class, that is really not a very good sign. And this being said, or these are the main downsides of having this approach, which once again is very popular, especially on legacy code bases on which you might work, and you find yourselves in such scenarios where you would have users that kind of like contain these type of properties and implementation for everything related to security, identity, and identity management. Okay, so let's go now to the second way that we could do this stuff. And yeah, we can then once again here go and say, let's create user class. And in this user class, in this time, we'll say, hey, okay, we've seen the downsides of the very first approach, which comes somehow naturally. So we are way smarter than that. So what we'll do here instead is, okay, we know that that we have existing libraries. For instance, in the .NET Core ecosystem, that would be Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity or Identity Server. No matter which one of those you use, actually the approach is quite similar. In our case, we use, and I have already installed the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity packages. Now, here you would say, okay, we are smarter than that, and instead of handling our own user stuff here, we just have this user class, and we make this user class actually inherit identity user, and the default identity user that we have in Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity uses string in the format of GUIDs for the identifiers. So right now we say, okay, we already have this identity part that is handled for us. So in this case, we are one step further, and we actually go here and say, in this case, we just want to extend this class, this existing class, with only the properties that we need for our employee stuff. Like in this case, we would have this first name, we have job title, we have department, and we have this monthly salary. And we don't really have to take care about the username, about password, about email address, and how we want to actually normalize the email address, how to want to reset password. Everything will be handled by the library. So instead of this, we just concentrate of the functionality that user, in our case an employee, would have in our application. So only the first name, job title, department, and monthly salary. And then, of course, if we go to the AppDB context here, as we are using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, our DB context class will not inherit the regular DB context, but will inherit the identity DB context class, which actually comes from our, or from the Microsoft, I guess it's Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core package. And this DB context already has a DB set for the identity user. So it's not something that we would need to actually take care about, but we want to actually be able to work with the set of the details that we actually want. And then we say we have a DB set of users and we call these users and get set, and everything should be fine. Of course, here we would actually need to add the reference, and that's it. Now, the thing is with this approach, which when compared to the first approach, is clearly preferable. So, because here basically what you do is, okay, I have some existing stuff from a library, I just reuse that, and I just extend it with the functionality that I am concerned about. So kind of like you do already a small separation between what actually Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity offers and what your application use case actually is. In our case, just managing employees. However, the problem with this approach is that kind of like you have extended an existing class already. And during the lifetime of your application, or during the different use cases or functionalities that you would have to implement, this type of setting up or handling users will also cause a lot of problems, because you would have different services from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity that mutate the state of your user, but you would also probably have your own services or handler, like an employee service, that would kind of like also mutate the state of the same class, actually, because it mutates the state of the user, but taking into consideration only a certain part of the properties. In our case, the properties that we have defined here. And this could actually bring in a lot of bugs and a lot of potential problems, because there are different type of services that in one way or another actually modify or mutate the exact same class. And this will for sure, when your application grows and grows, naturally, even if it becomes just a mid-sized application, you will get a lot of problems here from this approach. And that's also a sign, and one thing that I would have to actually state or emphasize based on my experience, because there is this huge I would say tantra with code reusability. We need to reuse code. We don't need to actually repeat ourselves, which is actually okay and correct. We have to think, or we have to be careful to not really do that. However, there is one other aspect to this that is kind of like almost never brought into the discussion. It is what does this actually mean when I am duplicating functionality, or when I am duplicating code? That's a really good question to ask, because from the fact that you just write down a set of properties that kind of like are similar, that doesn't really mean that you kind of like duplicate code, and that it is good to reuse existing code. Because once again, and I won't go back to the same topic that we actually discussed earlier, when it comes to these employees and users in our application, it's that we still have this kind of like split between two different concerns or two different responsibilities of this class. Because right now, this class, this user class, as it extends the identity user, it has two responsibilities. So the first responsibility would be the one to handle identity related stuff, and the second responsibility would be to actually handle the employee stuff that we want. So if we have two different responsibility, we are already violating the single responsibility principle, and we are, in a certain way, you will see, or you could surely think about that it in a way it will also violate the open close principles, because if you want to add additional functionality to your application, it will be a total mess. Like for instance, let's take an example. Let's move a little bit from the idea that we are building an employee management system, and to the idea that let's think about that we are building a new Uber. Now, the Uber application actually has two types of different users. Now, a user can be a rider and a user can be a driver. Now, when you sign into Uber, you actually sign in with the exact same account. But based on what you choose, you can choose to be a driver or you can choose to be a rider. And you can even switch between these different profiles. So right now, maybe you are a driver, but you just want to, I don't know, go to a party and you don't want to drink, so you want to call an Uber. So in that case, you will have to switch your profile to the rider, and you can then call an Uber to go yourself to that party. And you notice that in these use cases, the approach that we kind of like use here is actually not very good, because we cannot simply extend the functionality. We cannot simply add, I don't know, maybe some other type of properties that only concern a certain type of user and then also keep those. We would then have to add maybe another class that also inherits this identity user but has other properties. So once again, it will get very messy. Now, the thing is, or the question is, how can we actually work with users in a very practical way that actually will prevent us from running into a lot of bugs, and that's actually highly extensible. So you can even accommodate a lot of different types of scenarios, like the example that we gave with the Uber application. So let's go here to this other project, which we called here the best way. And I would say it's the most practical way to actually work with users. And the way that we have to think about this is, first of all, it's the thing that we have actually described for both of the previous use cases, is that you kind of like have two different responsibilities for one single class. So you have a responsibility for identity management and responsibility for employee management. So we want to actually change that. And if we have two different responsibilities, then we should have two different classes. And if we have two different classes, let's maybe also find a better way to actually express ourselves when we create the class for that. Now, let's create here one new, and let's call this employee. And you see that right now we don't have user, we just have an employee, because that's the main business of our application. It should handle employees. Now, user is very generic. So when you kind of like define the type of users or the users in your application, try to always be very specific to your business use case. So in our case, our users are employees. So we have employees. Cool. Now, the good thing here is that we can have here just the 4 properties that we want for our employee. But here there are a few things that we want to add. In this case, we will not extend any class. This is our standalone class that represents an employee, and that's totally different, conceptually different from what an identity user is in Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. So therefore, we might even want to have, I don't know, employee ID, get set, okay? And then there is one other thing, like kind of like a concession that we have to make, because the one way or the other, you kind of like need to link an employee to an identity that you have, or to an identity user. However, we don't want to do this link by simply inheriting the identity user. We want to keep everything separate, but we still need to kind of like link them together a little bit. So in this case, it is very actually simple to do this. We'll have a public string, and we'll have a property something like identity. Okay, and the cool thing that we have here is that, for instance, when you create a new identity, and then when you create a new employee from that identity, you will have to set the identity ID of the identity user. So let's go here to the program class. That would be something like that. var identity equals new identity user. Okay. Now, this new identity user will probably have an ID. So what you will do is that you have our employee equals, sorry for the typo, new employee. Okay. Did I? Yes. Let's. Okay, we have this employee. Cool. Now, the thing is, I say that the way that you link them together, you first create the identity, but then when the identity is created, to just have this link between your employee and the corresponding identity, you would have this employee dot identity ID equals identity dot ID. It would be something like that. And that's actually right now, once again, we talk very conceptually, but I want to show you this kind of procedure. Of course, that would you would put this in a real ASP.NET Core application, probably in a service or in a handler if you work with mediator and things like that. But the steps are always the same. You first create an identity using the identity user. You save that identity, whatever you use the user manager service to, or the user manager service to actually create it and set passwords and things similar to that. And after you have done that, you just create your employee and set the ID of the identity as the identity ID of the employee. And this is the way that you can actually link them together. And actually, this is also a way in which you can extend, for instance, your application to support different types of users. Because if we go back to this idea with the Uber application, in this case, we can have, for instance, we could have a profile. So we would call that profile, and we would create a profile for rider and a profile for the driver. But both of those profiles would have the same identity ID. And in that case, you can very easily in your application support this one identity. So one user that logs in, that changes password, that implements two-factor authentication, whatever. But it could have different type of profiles based on this link that we actually do here. And as said, for our employee class, this is actually one way or a minor concession that we have to actually do because we really need to keep track about the identity and when we have an employee to which exact identity it actually belongs. And in that case, everything is very, very segregated. All the classes have their own responsibility. Like the identity user has the responsibility of identity management, and the employee has only the responsibility of actually having or handling state for an employee, for an application, or for our very concrete business use case. So, therefore, as a key takeaway, whenever you need to start a new application from scratch and you have to think about how you actually want to handle users, please bear in mind that the most practical approach is actually to keep the two different concerns separate. So the identity management concern and then your user requirement concerns, they are two totally different things. Unless you are building your own identity system, like, I don't know, maybe Okta or your own Azure Active Directory or whatever. So unless you do that, or unless this is the real business use case of your application, then we have two different concerns. If you are building an identity management system, then actually the business concern of your system is identity management, and in that case you wouldn't have to actually create this or have this distinction. But unless you do this for any other type of application, there are two different concerns, and therefore you have to, or you need to have for those two different classes, like the identity user, which comes from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, or application user as it is in Identity Server. And then on the other hand, the employee, like we have in our case, which is the core business class or the core domain class for the business for which we want to actually create an application. So just go on and always do that and link them both through the identity ID that gets created when an when an identity user is created in the database. Set that identity ID to your employees or to your common or general purpose user profiles, and then you would be able to always link the identity to that specific employee. And if you want to extend to support different types of users, it's actually very, very easy, because you could have two different types of employees with different properties, but that they share the same identity ID. And in that case, you could even very easily create a database to kind of like find out for one identity how many different profiles do you have, or how many different employee types do you have. So that kind of like would be very, very easy. And I can ensure you that from a practical perspective, this approach will save you a lot of time on debugging, on fixing bugs and things similar to that, because we just follow a very, very basic principle. If we have two different concerns, then we split these concerns into two different classes that should actually not depend one on the other at all. That being said, thank you very, very much for watching. I hope this video was helpful for you. And if you think that it might be also helpful for others, please hit the thumbs up button, get involved in the community and leave a comment. I would like to get a discussion started here. And the more comments we get to this video, the better actually, or the more people will actually find this video through YouTube and will find it also useful. Also, don't be shy and share it in your, I don't know, networks, on social media or on Reddit, wherever you might see fit, or wherever you might think that you have connections or friends or peers that might benefit from this information. Don't be shy and share that. Once again, thank you very, very much for watching this video, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.